I still remember the exact moment the phone rang. It was early in the morning, sometime in late '63. Back then, I was a young test pilot out of Edwards, spending my days flying whatever experimental bird they threw my way. But this call wasn't the usual routine check-in. No introduction, no explanation. Just a calm voice on the other end telling me to be in Burbank at 0600 hours the next day. They gave me an address, nothing else. I almost didn't go. But something in the man's tone told me this wasn't a request. So, before dawn, I drove across the empty highways of Southern California, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than I wanted to admit. The address led me to a nondescript building near the Lockheed plant. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Inside, though, everything screamed classified: armed guards, clipped voices, and a stale smell of coffee and jet fuel. They walked me down a dim hallway into a briefing room. 3 men were already seated at the table, 2 in suits, 1 in a uniform I didn't recognize. No one smiled. No one offered a handshake. On the table, there were black and white photos scattered across a folder stamped restricted. I leaned in, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Blurry shapes, thin silhouettes, contrails bending unnaturally high in the atmosphere. One of the men finally spoke. "We're putting together a team," he said. "A very small, very selective team. We need someone who can handle more than just flying." He paused, letting that sink in. "This program doesn't exist. If you say yes, you don't talk about it. Not to your family, not to your friends, not to anyone." I wanted to ask questions: what kind of plane, what kind of missions, but the man in uniform cut me off. "It will fly higher and faster than anything you've ever touched. That's all you need to know right now." They showed me one last photo, grainy and distorted, but clear enough to make my pulse quicken. The thing in the picture didn't look like an aircraft. It looked like something pulled out of a science fiction magazine: long, razor-thin wings, a body shaped like an arrowhead, painted in black that swallowed the light around it. "This," one of them said, "is what you'll be flying. If you're good enough." I didn't even hesitate. "I'm in," I said, trying to sound confident, though my voice cracked just slightly. They didn't smile or congratulate me. They just handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Report to this location tomorrow. Be prepared to relocate." And remember, this conversation never happened. The next 48 hours were a blur. I packed a single duffel bag and left my life behind without explanation. No calls, no goodbyes. Just silence. When I arrived at the location in Nevada, a place that would later become infamous but at the time had no name on any map, I realized I was stepping into another world. Miles of desert, fences topped with razor wire, and hangars large enough to hide the future inside. Even then, I didn't fully grasp what I'd agreed to. They stripped us of anything personal: no watches, no photos, no pens. The first thing they drilled into us wasn't flying technique, it was secrecy. "Loose lips sink ships," they said, but this wasn't about ships. This was about something so far beyond what the public knew that even Congress barely had an idea it existed. The first time I caught a glimpse of the aircraft itself, it wasn't even in daylight. We were taken into a hangar in the dead of night. The lights were dim, just enough to cast sharp angles along the smooth black surface of the machine. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Sleek. Predatory. Almost alive. You could feel its presence, like it knew it was destined to rewrite the rules of the sky. One of the engineers, a quiet man with grease-stained hands, leaned over and whispered, "She doesn't forgive mistakes. Respect her, and she might just bring you home." That night, lying in the barracks, sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about that strange bird in the hangar and what they expected from me. I'd flown dangerous aircraft before, but this felt different. Bigger. There was a weight to it, a sense that if I failed, it wouldn't just cost me my life, it would cost something far greater. I didn't know it then, but that briefing in Burbank was the moment my life split into 2 timelines, the one everyone else saw, and the one buried under layers of classified reports and locked doors. And from that moment forward, I belonged to the sky, to the Blackbird, to the missions no one would ever talk about. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd said no that day. But deep down, I know the truth: I never really had a choice. Once you're invited into a world like that, you don't walk away. You can't. The first time I stood close enough to touch the Blackbird, the desert air felt heavier, almost electric, like the silence right before a summer storm. The hangar doors had been rolled open at dawn, letting in a pale, gray light that made the jet's black surface look even darker, so dark it didn't reflect anything, like it swallowed the world around it. I'd seen it from a distance before, hidden under tarps or parked at the far end of the runway, but this was different. This time, she was mine to learn, mine to fly. From the first step I took into that hangar, I felt small. The State Route 71 wasn't just big, it had a presence, something that made your pulse slow and your breath catch. It wasn't beautiful in the way fighters were, sleek curves and sharp angles that made you think of speed and agility. No, the Blackbird was something else. It looked dangerous. Purpose-built. The kind of machine that didn't care if you were ready, only that you didn't get in its way. One of the crew chiefs, a quiet man with sunburned skin and grease under his nails, noticed me staring. He gave me a nod, like a silent approval to step closer. When my hand brushed the cold titanium skin, it felt alien. Not smooth, not rough, just different, like it had been forged in a place where nothing human existed. It wasn't paint, they told us, it was a special coating to manage the heat that would build up when the plane sliced through the atmosphere at 3 times the speed of sound. Get to know her, the chief said quietly. She'll either trust you or she won't. And if she doesn't, you'll find out the hard way. Training to fly her was nothing like anything I'd done before. The first weeks weren't in the air at all, they were in classrooms, in simulators that barely scratched the surface of what the real bird could do. We drilled procedures until they felt like second nature. If a hydraulic line failed, you had seconds to act. If a compressor stalled, you had to reset it by instinct, not thought. They reminded us over and over, this wasn't a plane that gave second chances. Every morning started the same. Physical tests. Pressure chamber sessions to prepare us for the thin air at the edge of space. Endless briefings about fuel loads, temperature tolerances, and ejection protocols. We weren't just training to fly, we were training to survive the unknown. And then came the suit. The first time I was sealed into that pressure suit, it felt like being buried alive. The techs were calm, methodical, checking every seam and valve, reminding me to keep breathing slow and steady. The helmet locked with a sharp click, and suddenly, the world narrowed to the sound of my own breath and the steady hiss of oxygen. You'll learn to love the silence, one of the instructors said through the comms. Or it'll break you. That day, I climbed the ladder and looked into the cockpit for the first time. It wasn't like the fighters I knew, there were no friendly layouts, no intuitive designs. Just a sea of gauges, switches, and dials that looked like they'd been pulled from the future and assembled by someone who didn't care how human hands worked. The seat felt tight, molded not for comfort but efficiency. And the canopy above, it made the world look distant, like I was already halfway to space. The ground crew treated the Blackbird with a kind of reverence I had never seen before. Every bolt tightened with ritual precision, every checklist repeated until there were no doubts left. You didn't just prep the State Route 71, you prepared yourself to meet it, like a soldier gearing up for a war no one would ever hear about. The first taxi tests were brutal. Even at low speed, you could feel the power in her bones. The engine screamed in a way that rattled through your chest and made your teeth ache. The instructors warned us, she'll fight you on the ground. In the air, she's yours, if you earn her trust. I'll never forget that first engine run. Sitting there, strapped into the seat, I could feel the heat rising even before we hit full throttle. The world outside blurred in the shimmer of exhaust, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But then, just as quickly, the fear turned into something else, something sharp and focused. That night in the barracks, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every sound, every vibration, every instruction I had been given. The other pilots were the same. We spoke in hushed tones, comparing notes, trying to piece together what this machine wanted from us. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. The Blackbird wasn't just another aircraft. It was something alive. Over the next weeks, I watched her launch and land, each time more in awe. The way she would vanish into the horizon faster than your eyes could follow, the way the sonic boom would echo across the desert seconds after she was already gone. And when she returned, streaked with heat and dust, the crew would swarm her like bees to a hive, checking every inch, every seam, as if they were tending to something sacred. By the time my first real flight day came, I wasn't afraid anymore. Respectful, yes, terrified, no. I touched the Blackbird, learned her sounds, her temper. She was no longer just a machine in a hangar, she was my responsibility. And deep down, I think she knew it too. Standing there on the tarmac, helmet under my arm, I looked up at her one last time before climbing the ladder. For a brief second, I swore I saw my reflection in her black skin, not clear, just a faint outline, like she was watching me back. And then I understood what the crew chief meant. She didn't forgive mistakes. But if you treated her right, maybe, just maybe, she'd bring you home. The morning of my first flight, the desert was cold, the kind of sharp chill that seeps through your gloves and reminds you that even out here, nature doesn't care who you are. The runway stretched out like a black ribbon against the sand, and at the far end of it sat the blackbird, quiet but menacing, like a predator waiting for the kill. I'd spent weeks preparing, training, simulating every possible failure, but nothing in the world could prepare me for the moment I climbed that ladder and lowered myself into the cockpit for the first time, knowing she was about to leave the ground with me inside. The crew worked around me in silence, their movements sharp and precise, like a choreography they had done 100 times before. The helmet locked with a hiss, the comms checked, the oxygen flowing steady. One of the ground techs tapped my shoulder, gave me a nod, and pointed to the horizon like he was reminding me where I was headed. That small gesture stayed with me longer than it should have. As the engines roared to life, the ground shook beneath me. The sound was deafening, but inside the helmet, it was muted to a low growl, like a beast pacing its cage. The heat built up fast, and the instruments came alive, row after row of dials and gauges flickering into green and amber, each demanding my attention. My instructor's voice came through the headset, calm and steady, guiding me through the checks, but my hands were already moving on instinct. I had rehearsed this moment so many times that my body knew the dance even if my mind was racing. "Blackbird 1, cleared for takeoff," the tower said. The words felt surreal. This was it. No more simulations, no more briefings, just me, the jet, and the sky. I pushed the throttles forward, and the J-58 engine screamed, their power pressing me into the seat as we barreled down the runway. At 200 knots, the nose lifted. At 300, we were airborne. The desert dropped away, and the world below shrank until it was nothing but sand and silence. At 30,000 feet, the Blackbird came alive. She stopped fighting me and started to glide, smooth and steady, like she decided I was worth trusting. The climb was relentless, 50, 60, 70,000 feet, until the blue sky around us deepened into a shade so dark it almost looked black. Below, the curvature of the earth stretched out in every direction, and for a moment, I forgot about the mission, the training, the pressure suit. I just stared. I'd never seen the world like that before, so small and fragile, like it could slip through your fingers if you reached out too far. Then the radio crackled. It started faint, just a whisper under the static, so soft I thought it was interference. A few distorted words, almost like a voice, then silence. I glanced at the comms panel, checked the frequencies, everything was where it should be. I asked my instructor if he'd heard it, but he didn't respond, not right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped, sharp, like he wanted to change the subject. "Focus on your flight path," he said. "Altitude and heading." But the whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't English, not exactly. More like fragments of numbers, broken syllables, something that felt structured but wrong. My heart was pounding now, but my hands stayed steady on the controls. I didn't want to sound rattled, so I didn't mention it again. I just filed it away, a note in the back of my mind that something was off. We leveled out near Mach 3, the Blackbird steady and calm, the instruments holding where they should. On the radar, the sky was empty, no other aircraft for hundreds of miles. But then, out of nowhere, a small blip appeared on the scope. It wasn't supposed to be there. Too high, too fast, moving at a vector we didn't recognize. Before I could even call it out, the blip vanished. The instructor stayed quiet, didn't acknowledge it, and neither did the ground when we checked in. It was like it had never happened. On the descent, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, glitchy equipment, atmospheric interference, whatever excuse I could make to settle my nerves. But as we touched down and rolled along the runway, the tower came on the line with a tone I hadn't heard before. "Blackbird 1, taxi to secure hangar. Crew will debrief you there. No congratulations, no welcome back. Just orders." Inside the hangar, the mood was different. The ground crew moved quickly, eyes down, avoiding conversation. My instructor didn't look at me until we were in the debrief room. He closed the door, set the recorder on the table, and said one thing: "You didn't hear anything, and you didn't see anything. Understood?" I wanted to ask questions. God, I had so many questions. But something in his expression told me this wasn't the time. So, I nodded. Understood. That night, lying in the barracks, I replayed every second in my head. The whisper. The radar blip. The way everyone acted like none of it had happened. Maybe it was just a test, I told myself. Maybe they were trying to see how I'd handle the unexpected. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something they'd seen before, and whatever it was, they didn't want to talk about it. I didn't write it down. I didn't tell anyone. But from that day forward, every time I climbed into that cockpit, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Blackbird wasn't the only thing watching the skies. Flying over the Iron Curtain was nothing like the test flights in the desert. Those early days at Groom Lake taught us to respect the Blackbird, to understand her quirks, to work with her instead of against her. But the first time you take her into hostile airspace, when you know that every radar in the country below is trying to lock onto you, that respect turns into something sharper. Fear. Focus. Survival. The briefing room was silent that morning, except for the steady hum of the projector. Maps of Eastern Europe glowed against the wall, red circles marking SAM sites, radar grids, and airbases. The mission profile was straightforward on paper: cross the border, gather imagery, get out. The kind of job the Blackbird was built for. But everyone in that room knew what was at stake. If anything went wrong, there would be no rescue, no denial, no explanation. We'd just disappear. I remember strapping into the suit, the tech sealing every scene with careful hands. Inside the helmet, the air smelled metallic and clean, a mix of oxygen and nerves. My backseater gave me a thumbs up as the ladder clanged against the fuselage. The sun was just starting to rise, and for a second, I caught my reflection in the jet's skin, distorted and ghost-like, as if I was already part of something I couldn't escape. Takeoff was smooth, almost routine. The Blackbird leapt from the runway like she was hungry for the sky. By the time we leveled at cruising altitude, the world below had faded into a blur of muted colors: forests, rivers, cities, all swallowed by distance. From up there, it was easy to forget that the ground wasn't empty. That people were looking up, tracking us, calculating every angle to bring us down. Crossing the border was when everything changed. The radio came alive with coded chatter from ground control, but it wasn't our voices I was focused on, it was theirs. The enemy radar pings started almost immediately, sharp pulses echoing through the systems. You could feel them probing, painting us, trying to catch us in their net. My backseater's voice cut through the static, calm but clipped. Multiple locks. SAM sites active. The Blackbird didn't care. She stayed smooth and steady, like she was daring them to try. At Mach 3, altitude above 80,000 feet, we were ghosts to most of their missiles. But that didn't stop the alerts from flashing across the panel. Each one was a reminder that we were one malfunction away from becoming wreckage scattered across enemy soil. I kept my eyes on the instruments, hands steady, breathing slow. The training kicked in: trust the jet, trust the profile, trust the numbers. But then something strange happened. On the radar scope, a shape appeared, fast, climbing, closing the gap from below. Not a missile. Not a fighter, at least not one we recognized. It moved in a way that didn't make sense, darting left, then right, keeping perfect pace with us for a few seconds before vanishing like it was never there. I didn't say anything at first. Neither did my backseater. We just looked at the scope, then at each other, and kept flying. Whatever it wasn't in the mission brief, and asking questions we couldn't answer wasn't going to help us make it home. The cameras clicked steadily in the nose bay, capturing everything the analysts back home wanted to see: missile deployments, rail lines, new airframes on the tarmac of bases we weren't supposed to know existed. We stayed on course, every second ticking by like an eternity. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the alerts faded. The locks dropped. The sky went quiet again. Coming back across the border, the adrenaline hit hard. You could feel it in the way your shoulders ached, in the sharp burn of every breath. But you didn't celebrate. Not up there. You just stayed locked in until the wheels hit the runway and the ground crew swarmed the jet, their faces unreadable behind mirrored visors. The debrief was clinical, as always. Timelines, altitudes, data checks. Not a word about the radar anomaly, not even a raised eyebrow when the tape showed a brief blip moving at impossible speeds. When I mentioned it, the room went quiet. One of the analysts closed the folder in front of him and said, "You saw a reflection." Nothing more. But I knew better. And so did my backseater. Neither of us spoke about it again, but every mission after that, we both watched the radar a little closer, waiting for the impossible to appear again. Flying over the curtain became routine in the months that followed. The fear never went away, but it dulled, replaced by something colder, discipline, maybe. You stop thinking about what's below you, about the people trying to erase you from the sky. You just focus on the profile, the numbers, the sound of the engine steady and true. And yet, there were moments, small, quiet moments, when the job cut through the noise. Like the time we banked hard over the Baltic, and I caught a glimpse of the sunrise spilling across the horizon, the earth curving beneath us, painted in colors no one else would ever see from that height. Or the night mission when the northern lights danced around the canopy, green and violet streaks wrapping the blackbird in an otherworldly glow, as if the sky itself was acknowledging our presence. Those moments stayed with me. They reminded me why we did it, why we risked everything every time we crossed that invisible line. It wasn't for the politics, or the headlines, or the brass waiting in some quiet office back home. It was for the machine, for the team that kept her alive, for the unspoken bond between the men who strapped themselves into that black arrow and pointed it into the unknown. Even now, decades later, I can still close my eyes and feel it, the weight of the helmet pressing down, the low hum of the engines vibrating through my bones, the thin line of the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. And every so often, in the quiet hours of the night, I wonder about that radar blip, that shadow that kept pace with us for a few impossible seconds. Whatever it was, it stayed over there, behind the curtain. But I have a feeling we weren't the only ones flying missions no one ever talked about. The Arizona desert is quiet at night, but that night in 1967, it felt like the silence was holding its breath. We were supposed to run a standard systems test, nothing risky, nothing out of the ordinary. Just a shakedown flight to evaluate some new engine calibration before the next overseas mission. The kind of flight that was supposed to end with a clean logbook and a beer back at the barracks. The takeoff from Groom was smooth. The blackbird climbed like she always did, hungry for altitude. The stars above were sharp, like shards of glass scattered across the sky. I leveled her at just under Mach 3 as we crossed into Arizona airspace, the desert stretching endlessly below. From up there, it looked calm. Safe. 40 minutes into the flight, the first warning light blinked on the panel, a flicker at first, then steady. Hydraulic pressure in the left system dropping fast. I called it in, voice steady, the way we'd been trained, but my gut was already tightening. The State Route 71 could take a beating, but hydraulic issues were no joke. Without those systems, you were flying a black dart with no way to land it in one piece. We throttled back, dropped to a lower altitude, and began the emergency checklist. The desert below was empty, no towns, no lights, just endless sand and scrub. Command gave us a vector toward an auxiliary strip, a rough, secret runway carved into the middle of nowhere, one of those places that officially didn't exist. But as we lined up for descent, everything started to go wrong. The left hydraulic system bled out completely. The landing gear didn't want to lock. The controls were sluggish, fighting me with every movement. I could feel the heat rising inside the suit as sweat stung my eyes. The blackbird wasn't just heavy in my hands, she felt angry, like she knew we were trying to put her down somewhere she didn't belong. We hit the dirt strip hard. Too hard. The kind of landing that rattles your bones and makes you wonder if the airframe will stay in one piece. But somehow, she held together. We skidded down the length of the runway, kicking up a storm of dust, until the world went still again. For a moment, neither of us said a word. Just the sound of cooling metal ticking under the desert night. Then the radios came alive, confirmation that a recovery crew was inbound, told us to stay put, keep the aircraft secured, and wait. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was a star, bright, steady, too still to be a plane. But then it moved. Not fast, not erratic. Just deliberate. It hovered above the horizon, a faint blue glow cutting against the black. My backseater muttered something, his voice tight. "You seeing that?" I didn't answer. I just watched as the light shifted, dipping lower, then climbing again, like it was searching. It wasn't on radar. It wasn't on any frequency. But it was there, and it was close. We killed every non-essential system, hoping to make the jet look like a cold piece of metal on the ground. The desert was silent again, except for the faint hum in the headset, a low, steady tone I'd never heard before. It wasn't interference. It was something else. Minutes felt like hours until the recovery convoy finally rolled in. trucks, armed security, maintenance crews, all moving with the urgency of men who'd been told not to ask questions. The glow in the sky faded the moment their headlights washed over the runway, like it had been waiting for us to be alone. We were ordered out of the jet, escorted to one of the trucks, and told to keep our helmets on. They didn't speak during the ride, just kept their eyes on the road, their rifles resting casually but ready. Back at the hangar, the debrief was quick and sharp. Mechanical failure, they said. Nothing more. The logbooks were adjusted, the incident classified under standard malfunction, and we were told to take a day off before the next flight. But here's what never made it into the report: every man on that recovery team swore they saw the same glow. Some said it was a drone, some said it was a trick of the light, but none of them could explain why the radios had picked up that tone. For weeks after, I caught myself scanning the night sky during flights, searching for that faint blue shimmer. Nothing. Just stars and empty blackness. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't a malfunction or a reflection or anything that could be explained by physics or procedure. Years later, when the program started to wind down, I asked one of the engineers if anyone had ever logged anomalous lights during flights. He didn't look up from his coffee when he answered. "We don't log things like that," he said. Then he stood, dropped his empty cup in the trash, and walked away without another word. The Arizona incident never left me. Not because of the landing or the failure, pilots have close calls all the time. It stayed with me because of the silence that followed, the unspoken understanding among everyone who was there that night. Even now, when I think about that faint hum in the headset, the glow over the horizon, I wonder if we interrupted something that wasn't meant to be seen. And if, in that quiet desert night, something out there was watching us just as closely as we were watching it. It started during a night run over the North Atlantic in late '68. The mission was straightforward: high-speed recon, up near the edge of controlled airspace, nowhere near anything that should have interfered with our systems. The Blackbird was running smooth, engine steady, the usual symphony of power you grow used to after enough hours in the cockpit. But then, right after we hit altitude and leveled out, the first sound came through the headset. At first, I thought it was feedback, just static or some stray interference. But then it formed a pattern. Not words, not exactly, but something that sounded organized. A low, pulsing tone that rose and fell in perfect intervals, like a signal searching for a lock. I keyed the mic and checked with my RSO in the back seat. "You hearing that?" His reply came slow. "Yeah, and it's not on any channel I've got open." We scanned through every frequency, flipped through backup radios, even killed and reset the system. Nothing stopped it. The tone stayed with us, steady, calm, almost patient, like it knew we were listening. A few minutes later, something stranger happened. The INS, our inertial navigation system, drifted. Not by much, but enough to notice. At Mach 3, a few degrees off course could send you hundreds of miles out of your flight path, so it got our attention. We corrected, recalibrated, but the drift kept happening, almost like we were being nudged. The tone in the headset followed us the whole way back across the Atlantic, never rising, never fading. Just there. Watching. Back at Groom, we reported everything by the book: system anomalies, radio interference, INS drift. The techs went through the jet from nose to tail and found nothing. Every system checked out. Clean bird, they said, like we'd imagined the whole thing. But the next flight, over the Arctic routes, it happened again. Same tone, same low, rhythmic pulse. My RSO started recording at this time, running a loop through his equipment to see if anyone on the ground could analyze it. When we landed, the tape disappeared. One of the program guys, civilian, no name tag, the kind who never smiled, took it from the cockpit before we even unstrapped. "Classified material," he said, and that was the end of it. After that, we stopped talking about it. At least, not where anyone official could hear. Pilots are superstitious by nature, and the Blackbird had its own share of strange habits, but this was different. The tone kept showing up, not every mission, but enough that you started to expect it when you crossed certain latitudes or passed over certain zones. It was never tied to weather, or altitude, or even enemy radar. It was just there. The strangest night came a few months later. We were running a route up near the edge of Soviet airspace, skirting the line, gathering what we needed without stepping over. About an hour into the flight, the tone shifted. It wasn't the steady pulse anymore. It spiked, sharp and fast, like someone had turned the volume up without warning. And then we heard voices. Not clear, not in English, not even in a language I could place. Just a chorus of whispers, layered over the tone, cutting in and out as if they were passing through our systems by accident. My RSO swore he heard our call signs in the mix, like something out there knew exactly who we were. We aborted the mission and headed home, silent the whole way back. The debrief was short: fuel issue, system anomaly, nothing worth filing beyond the basics. But that night, alone in my quarters, I played the events back over and over. The hum, the whispers, the way the jet had felt heavier in the air, like we weren't alone up there. Other pilots started sharing similar stories in hushed tones. One swore he'd heard coordinates embedded in the pulses. Another said the tone stopped completely the moment he powered down over a certain patch of ocean, only to start again as soon as he climbed back up. No one ever found a source. No one ever logged it officially. Years later, after the program started to wind down, I tried to track down any record of those tapes, those strange frequencies we'd caught in the air. Nothing. It was like they'd been erased, locked away in some vault where even the people who flew the missions couldn't access them. I've flown through storms that would shake the skin off lesser planes. I've dodged missiles and outrun fighters that never even saw us on their radar. None of that scared me. But those tones, those ghost frequencies, they still creep into my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm out in the desert at night, I'll bring a scanner and flip through the bands, just to see if I hear it again. Most nights, it's just static. But every now and then, just as the air turns cold and still, I'll catch a faint pulse. Low. Rhythmic. Patient. Like it's still out there, waiting for someone to answer. I'd flown the Blackbird enough times to think I understood her. Every sound, every vibration, every quirk of that jet was burned into my memory. But that mission, one I never saw written down, one they swore never happened, taught me that the State Route 71 had secrets even her own pilots didn't know. It was early 1971, a cold morning at Beale. The briefing was shorter than usual, no standard rundown, just a thin folder with coordinates and a single note: test envelope. Push the ceiling. Record everything. That was it. No mention of what they were looking for, no explanation why they wanted to risk a bird worth millions and 2 lives on board. I didn't ask questions. Nobody ever did. You nodded, you strapped in, and you flew the mission. Takeoff was routine. The air was clear, the engines smooth, the afterburners lighting up the runway like daylight as we climbed. The RSO in the back seat kept quiet, which told me he was just as uneasy as I was. At 30,000 feet, we leveled briefly, then punched forward, climbing hard. The Blackbird responded like she always did, steady, controlled, hungry for altitude. At 75,000 feet, most aircraft would have started shaking apart. Not the State Route 71. She cut through the stratosphere like a blade. The sky faded from blue to a deep violet, the curvature of the earth stretching out in every direction. Below us, the world was quiet. Above us, only the thin edge of space. Then the order came through a secure channel. A voice I didn't recognize, cold and calm: increase throttle. Maintain course. No deviations. We pushed past Mach 3. The cabin temp rose, the hull expanded the way it always did, and the gauges ticked into ranges we'd only seen in simulations. I remember my hands tightening on the controls, not out of fear, but from the sense that I was flying into something no one else had touched before. At Mach 3.4, the first anomaly hit. The airspeed indicator froze for 2 seconds, then jumped ahead, climbing so fast I thought the gauge had broken. The INS drifted next, showing us somewhere over the Pacific when I knew we were still above the desert. Navigation's gone, my RSO said, his voice flat but tense. We're blind. I wanted to abort. Every instinct screamed that we were past the edge of safe flight. But the voice on the radio came through again, this time sharper: maintain heading. Do not descend. Then the strangest thing happened. The Blackbird stopped feeling heavy. It's hard to explain if you've never flown her, but at that speed, the jet always felt alive, turbulent, breathing, fighting the air. Now it was like we'd slipped into something else entirely. No drag. No resistance. Just a smooth, endless glide. The horizon bent farther, the stars above sharper, brighter, almost too bright to look at. The ground below disappeared. I couldn't see the desert, the ocean, nothing. Just darkness, and a faint glow along the edge of the planet that looked unreal, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold. Then, for exactly 13 seconds, all comms died. Radios, telemetry, even the cockpit intercom, gone. Just silence. I glanced at my RSO, and he was staring straight ahead, frozen. Later, he swore he'd seen something out there during those seconds. Shapes, faint lights, something moving parallel to us. When the systems came back online, we were still at speed, still in control, but everything felt wrong. The gauges read impossible numbers. Fuel flow had stabilized in a way that defied physics, and the engines, normally deafening at that throttle, had gone eerily quiet. Then, just as suddenly, the voice returned. Same tone, same calm delivery, reduced throttle. Return to base. Do not exceed parameters again. We descended, slow and careful. By the time we hit standard altitude, the Blackbird felt normal again, loud, hot, alive. Landing was uneventful, but the ground crew looked at us like they'd been waiting for a crash report. The debrief was brief and cold. A couple of men in suits, civilians, but the kind you didn't cross, took our recorders, our flight suits, even our watches. One of them told us to forget what you experienced and reminded us of the paper we'd signed the day we joined the program. Officially, the flight never happened. No log, no record, not even a notation in maintenance reports. The bird was inspected, cleared, and sent back into rotation like nothing unusual had occurred. But things weren't normal after that. My RSO put in for a transfer 6 months later, citing personal reasons. I stayed, but every time I took her up after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brushed against something we weren't meant to. Years later, long after the Blackbird had been retired, I heard whispers from a former Lockheed engineer over a quiet drink. He didn't give details, but he said they'd learned something from those test flights, something that had nothing to do with reconnaissance or speed records. He called it the edge. The edge of what? I asked. He just smiled, finished his drink, and said, the edge of where we're allowed to be. I never got an answer that made sense, but I know what I felt in that cockpit. For a few impossible minutes, we were somewhere beyond altitude, beyond speed, beyond anything a human should have been able to touch. And whatever was out there, whatever we brushed against, I can still feel it sometimes when the night is quiet enough, the hum of those engines, the weightlessness, the sense that something was watching, just beyond the limits. I'd heard plenty of strange stories during my years around the Blackbird, but nothing ever stuck with me like what happened to Captain Jack Mercer. If you've been in the program long enough, you know his name. Or maybe you don't, because after that mission, they did everything they could to erase him, like he'd never been part of the team. Jack wasn't the kind of guy you forgot. Tall, calm under pressure, the kind of pilot everyone trusted without a second thought. He'd flown combat missions in Southeast Asia before being handpicked for the State Route 71 program. By the time I met him, he had logged more hours in the Blackbird than anyone except a handful of test pilots. He knew that jet like it was part of him. The last time I saw him was in the ready room at Beale. It was early 1973, gray skies over the base, that quiet tension in the air that always meant something classified was about to happen. Jack had a folder under his arm, thin, like they always were when the brass didn't want you to know much. He just gave me a half smile and said, "See you after, pal." But he never came back. Officially, the mission was over Nevada airspace, some kind of high-altitude calibration run. That's what they told us, anyway. But the details didn't add up. I know for a fact that when his Blackbird left the runway, it wasn't headed west, it was on a vector that pointed north, straight toward the Arctic. The tower logged clean comms during ascent. At 70,000 feet, Jack radioed in, calm as ever. "Bird steady, readings nominal," he said. Then, a pause. A faint click. And then just one last transmission, clipped and strange. "Seeing something up here." After that, silence. No mayday, no system failure alerts, nothing. One moment, they had him on scope, flying a perfect line. The next, the radar track blinked out, gone, like someone flipped a switch. The Blackbird didn't descend, didn't drift off course. It just disappeared. Recovery teams were scrambled within the hour. They covered hundreds of miles of airspace, scoured remote desert, even pushed into Canadian airspace. Not a single scrap of wreckage was found. No heat signature, no debris trail. It was like the jet had never left the ground. For 2 days, they locked down the base. Nobody came in or out without a badge and an armed escort. The suits, those civilian types who always showed up when things went sideways, took over operations. They pulled us into a briefing room one by one, asked the same questions over and over. Had Jack said anything unusual? Had we noticed changes in the aircraft maintenance logs? Did we know anything about his personal life? They didn't find what they were looking for. 3 weeks later, they declared him Kia. Training accident, they said, as if a man like Jack could have just had an accident in a machine he practically built with his own hands. His name was scrubbed from some of the flight logs, his locker cleared out, and the younger guys were told to stop asking questions. But here's the part they never explained. 2 months after Jack vanished, a maintenance crew out of Groom Lake reported something on their scopes. High altitude, high speed, moving too fast to identify, but the transponder pinged a code tied to Jack's aircraft ID. They wrote it off as a ghost code, a system error. But those guys swore up and down that what they saw was real. I didn't believe it, at least, not until the night I picked up a transmission. It was 1975, 2 years after Jack's disappearance. I was on a night run over the Pacific, somewhere off the California coast, when the secondary comm channel lit up. It wasn't standard protocol, but I flipped the switch. What I heard still makes my skin crawl. It was Jack's voice. Distorted, faint, like it was coming from somewhere far away, but unmistakable. Do you copy? Tell them, not what they think, it's not what they think. Then static. Nothing else. I reported it after landing. The techs ran every diagnostic they had, trying to pin the transmission on some kind of radio bleed or atmospheric bounce. But the frequency? It was one we didn't use anymore, one that had been retired after Jack's flight. I stopped talking about it after that. Not because I didn't want to, but because the warning was clear. One of the program directors pulled me aside and said, "For your own good, pilot, you didn't hear a thing. Understood?" Years passed. The Blackbird was retired. Most of the guys who'd been there back then scattered into civilian jobs or vanished into deeper black programs. I thought I'd made my peace with it, until 1992, when a letter showed up in my mailbox. No return address. No signature. Just a single sheet of paper with coordinates scrawled on it, in a handwriting I hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. Jack's. I never went to those coordinates. To this day, I don't know if that makes me a coward or smart. But I do know one thing, the State Route 71 didn't just vanish that day. And neither did Jack Mercer. Some of the guys still whisper that he slipped beyond the envelope, that he found whatever it was the brass kept pushing the Blackbird toward. Maybe they're right. Maybe he's still out there, flying higher and faster than anyone can imagine, somewhere past the edge of the sky. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the air is still and the world feels smaller than it should, I swear I can hear that faint hum, the sound of a J-58 engine at full burn, fading somewhere beyond the horizon. The Arctic was always the strangest part of the flight envelope. At 70,000 feet, with the world spread out below you like a frozen map, you feel like you've left Earth behind. The ground isn't really ground anymore, it's just a sheet of white stretching endlessly, broken only by jagged lines of ice and the occasional dark ribbon of open water. But it's the silence that gets you. Not the silence in the cockpit, that's always there, but the silence in your own mind, the sense that the world below has stopped, frozen in time. I flew that route more times than I can count. Recon missions over the Arctic weren't unusual during the height of the Cold War. The Soviets had assets scattered up there, submarine bases, radar arrays, listening posts buried in the ice. But the run I'm talking about didn't feel like any other. It was early 1974, winter light barely touching the horizon, and I was strapped into the Blackbird with my usual RSO, Daniels. The brief was thin, as always. Launch from Beale, refuel over Canada, head due north for a long sweep along the pole, then back south over Alaska. Simple in theory. But the moment we crossed into the Arctic airspace, I knew something was off. At first, it was just the radio. Static, faint but persistent, bleeding into every channel. It wasn't atmospheric interference, we knew what that sounded like. This was different. It had a rhythm, almost like it was pulsing. Daniels tried to track the source, but every time he locked onto a frequency, it would shift, slipping just out of range. We climbed higher, pushing Mach 3.2, and the static faded. For a while, everything was normal. Systems checked out, fuel was stable, engines humming like they always did when the Blackbird settled into her groove. We even started to relax. But then the horizon began to glow. Not the orange of sunrise, not the soft shimmer of aurora, this was something else. A pale, cold light, spreading across the curve of the earth, like a second dawn. Daniels tapped the canopy, muttering, "You seeing that?" I saw it. And I didn't like it. The light didn't move like the northern lights. It pulsed, faint at first, then brighter, like it was answering some unspoken signal. And with every pulse, the instruments in the cockpit glitched. Not catastrophic, but subtle, altitude readings flickering, compass spinning for half a second, then snapping back. "Command, this is Habu 1. Do you copy?" Daniels tried the main channel. Nothing but dead air. I switched to the emergency frequency. Still nothing. It was like the entire world below us had gone silent. We kept flying, because that's what you do. You trust the jet, you trust your training. But the further north we pushed, the stranger it got. At one point, Daniels said the inertial navigation showed us flying over an ocean trench that shouldn't exist. I laughed it off at first, said maybe the coordinates were glitched from the interference. But he swore the readings were accurate, and Daniels wasn't the kind of guy to imagine things. Then, at the very edge of our route, something appeared on radar. It wasn't a blip. It wasn't a plane or a missile or anything we'd ever trained for. It was just a distortion. Like the radar couldn't decide what it was seeing. Daniels ran 3 sweeps, recalibrated the system, and still got the same return, a moving anomaly, 30 miles ahead, matching our speed. I pushed the throttle, and so did the anomaly. For 2 minutes, we were locked in that strange chase, the blackbird screaming through the Arctic silence, the world below nothing but white blur. Then, just as suddenly, the distortion stopped. It didn't slow. It didn't veer off. It just disappeared. That's when the light flared. The cockpit went white, so bright it hurt even behind the visor. Every system screamed, warnings, fuel alarms, navigation errors, then died. Both engines flamed out in perfect unison, and for a second, the Blackbird became a glider at the edge of the stratosphere. "Restart," I barked. My hands moved on instinct, going through the relight sequence while Daniels worked the auxiliary systems. For 30 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, like the jet had been yanked back into reality, the J-58S roared to life, the instruments steadied, and the world returned to what it had been. Except, we weren't where we were supposed to be. The NAV showed we'd been displaced by nearly 200 miles. Fuel burn was wrong, like we'd been flying longer than the clock indicated. But there was no sign of damage, no explanation. And the radio? Crystal clear again, as if nothing had happened. Command didn't want to hear the details when we landed. They filed it under electromagnetic interference and instrument failure, then locked the report. Daniels and I were debriefed separately. They asked about physiological effects, about what we saw, about whether we'd experienced time distortion. That was the phrase they used. Time distortion. A week later, Daniels requested a transfer. He never told me why, but I didn't have to ask. He didn't want to fly the Arctic again. Years later, long after the Blackbird had been retired, I read a declassified note, buried in a batch of unrelated documents, mentioning unexplained signal returns over the Arctic corridor dating back to the late 50s. Same coordinates we'd flown. Same anomalies. Sometimes I wonder if that silence up there isn't silence at all. Maybe it's something else, something watching, something waiting. Every time I think about it, I remember that brief moment when the engines were dead and the world was nothing but light and quiet. And in that quiet, just for a second, I swear I heard something that wasn't static. It sounded like a voice, faint and distant, saying something I couldn't quite understand. I never flew that route again. And to this day, whenever I hear the phrase Arctic silence, my chest tightens, because I know better than most, silence isn't always empty. Sometimes, it's full of things you'll never be able to explain. I wasn't supposed to see those files. Even after I retired, I knew better than to dig too deep. The Blackbird program had layers of secrecy that went far beyond what the public understood. But in 1997, a year after the official retirement of the State Route 71, a box showed up in my mailbox. No return address, no note, just a stack of faded folders stamped declassified in red ink. I thought it was a prank at first. Maybe one of the guys from Beale thought it would be funny to mess with the old pilot. But when I opened the first folder and saw my own name in the header, mission date, tail number, flight path, I stopped laughing. Someone wanted me to know something. The first few pages were familiar. routine after-action reports, weather logs, refueling data. Then, halfway through the stack, I found something I'd never seen before: internal memos, written in clipped language, about non-standard anomalies encountered during high-altitude reconnaissance. The dates lined up with flights I'd been on. One memo described a temporal displacement during a polar run in 1974. That was the mission Daniels and I never talked about, the one over the Arctic where the instruments failed and the jet relit like nothing had happened. The report didn't call it interference. It didn't blame the equipment. It used the word event. I felt my hands shaking as I read. According to the memo, we'd lost 23 minutes of telemetry. The plane's black box recorded a blank stretch, no engine data, no navigation readings, nothing. It was like the aircraft had been erased for nearly half an hour, then dropped back into reality. The next file was worse. It was from 1968, long before I joined the program. And State Route 71 out of Kadena was running a sweep over the Sea of Japan. The pilot reported seeing a metallic object maintaining station at Mach 3. The RSO's notes were even stranger: the object wasn't just keeping up, it was pacing them, mirroring every turn. Then, without warning, it vanished. No radar return, no heat signature, nothing. The official conclusion: unexplained atmospheric reflection. But someone had underlined that phrase in pencil, and in the margin, they'd written a single word: observed. By the third folder, I realized these weren't just random reports. They were a pattern, cases where crews encountered something they couldn't explain, and the higher-ups buried the evidence. The files mentioned everything from ghost radar returns to unexplained spikes in radiation to crew members experiencing blackouts mid-flight. And then I found the photographs. Most were grainy, low-resolution shots from recon cameras, horizon lines, cloud banks, and strange streaks of light that didn't match any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. One photo stopped me cold. It was taken during a mission I flew in 1978 over Eastern Europe. I remembered that run. Smooth flight, no anomalies, just another day in the office. But the photo showed something I'd never seen: a perfect sphere of light hovering just off our right wing, blurred but unmistakable. There was no mention of it in my post-flight debrief. No one had ever told me. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note, scrawled on lined paper. They never told you everything. Some of us tried. Be careful who you trust. No signature. For weeks, I didn't sleep. I'd sit in my garage at night, the folders spread out on my workbench, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about Daniels, about the way he'd avoided my calls after his transfer. I thought about the guys who'd left the program suddenly, no explanation, just gone. And I thought about the briefings where they told us, straight-faced, that what we'd seen wasn't real. I considered turning the box over to someone: journalists, historians, anyone who might care. But every time I picked up the phone, I felt the same cold knot in my gut that I'd felt the day of that Arctic run, when the world went white and silent. The files were more than stories. They were proof that the Blackbird wasn't just a plane. It was a key, something that had unlocked doors no one wanted to admit existed. Months later, I heard about a crash out near Groom Lake. An old colleague told me, in hushed tones, that a test article had gone down during a classified run. Officially, it was engine failure. Unofficially, the telemetry showed the aircraft accelerating beyond its safe envelope, like something was pulling it faster than the J-58S could take it. The parallels to the files in my garage were impossible to ignore. Eventually, I packed the folders back into the box and locked it in a storage unit 2 towns over. I don't visit often, but I keep the key close. Because deep down, I know whoever sent me that box is either gone or in hiding, and if they wanted me to have it, there's a reason. Sometimes, late at night, I'll be sitting in my backyard, looking up at the sky, and I'll hear it, the faint echo of the Blackbird's engines, the whisper of Mach 3 slicing through the stratosphere. And I'll wonder if we ever really understood what we were flying through. Those declassified files didn't give me answers. They just gave me better questions. Like why the anomalies always happened in the same corridors. Why time itself seemed to bend in those frozen stretches of sky. And why, after all these years, someone out there still doesn't want the truth to surface. The world thinks the State Route 71 was retired because satellites made it obsolete. Maybe that's true. Or maybe the plane had started to uncover things no one wanted to confront. I've thought about burning the box more times than I can count. But I can't. Because part of me still believes that one day, someone's going to come looking for the truth. And when they do, those files will be the only map left to follow. I didn't know it would be my last time in the cockpit. None of us did. The orders came in quiet, almost casual, like it was just another run. They told us it was a routine farewell flight, a symbolic gesture before the bird was finally grounded for good. March 6, 1990. Palmdale to Washington, D.C. One last mission for the record books. I'd flown that route dozens of times, but that morning felt different. The hangar was quiet in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The crew went through their motions, but nobody was smiling. Even the chief mechanic, a guy who could crack jokes in the middle of a storm, just handed me the clipboard and muttered, "Take care of her." Our jet that day was tail number 17972, a bird I'd trusted for years. She wasn't just an aircraft to me, she was a living thing, stubborn but reliable, with scars from missions we'd never talk about. As I climbed the ladder into the cockpit, I ran my glove along the side of the fuselage. Cold to the touch, even in the California sun. My recon systems officer, Carter, strapped in behind me. He didn't say much. He never did. But I could hear the tightness in his breathing through the intercom as we went through the checklist. When the J-58S roared to life, the hangar trembled. The sound was deafening and comforting all at once, like the world itself was reminding us what we were sitting in. We were cleared for takeoff just after dawn. The sky was clear, the air smooth. As we climbed through 30,000 feet, I glanced down at the coastline one last time. California disappearing beneath us, the ocean stretching forever. It struck me then, how much of my life had been spent up here, looking down on the world at speeds and heights most people couldn't imagine. The first hour was textbook. We hit Mach 3 over the Midwest, the engines humming like they always did when we hit the sweet spot. Carter called out fuel levels and course corrections, his voice flat and steady. For a while, it almost felt like any other mission. Then, somewhere over the Appalachians, the jet did something I'd never felt before. A shudder, not turbulence, not a compressor stall, just a deep, low vibration that rattled the frame. Every gauge stayed green. No alarms. No warnings. But for about 15 seconds, the Blackbird felt off. Carter noticed it too. "You feel that?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice level. "Everything's in the green." "Doesn't feel like it." We didn't talk about it after that. Pilots don't like to speculate in the air. But I kept one eye on the gauges, and the other on the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to explain what we'd felt. We landed at Dulles in the late afternoon, the crowd waiting on the tarmac cheering like we'd just won a war. They had cameras, reporters, even a brass band. Carter and I climbed down the ladder into a sea of handshakes and flashes. They called it a celebration. To me, it felt like a funeral. That night, I stayed with the jet in the hangar long after everyone else had gone home. The lights were dim, the air thick with the smell of fuel and hot metal. I sat on a toolbox and just stared at her. All those missions, all those nights skimming the edge of space, and now she'd spend the rest of her life as an exhibit. That vibration we'd felt? Nobody ever explained it. The engineers tore through every inch of her, every sensor log, every bolt and rivet, and found nothing out of the ordinary. But I knew what I felt. Carter did too. Something had brushed against us out there, on that last run, something we couldn't name or measure. A few weeks later, the rumors started. Quiet talk among old crews about anomalies in the final flights. Not mechanical issues, stranger things. Time skips. Instrument glitches. One guy swore his altimeter showed 100,000 feet for nearly a minute, even though that was impossible. Another said his fuel calculations didn't add up, like the jet had burned less than it should have. We laughed about it in the bars, but deep down, none of us were really laughing. The Blackbird had always been ahead of its time, skimming the edge of physics itself. Maybe that last flight wasn't just a farewell. Maybe the jet was telling us something, that we'd pushed it, and ourselves, as far as we could go. Years later, when the Smithsonian rolled her into the exhibit hall, I took my kids to see her. She looked different there, under the soft museum lights, polished and silent. Strangers walked around snapping photos, reading the plaques, talking about speed records and engineering marvels. None of them knew what it felt like to be inside her at Mach 3, the world falling away beneath you. I rested my hand on her nose, just for a second. The metal was cool, lifeless. And yet, for the briefest moment, I swear I heard it, the low, distant rumble of those engines, echoing from somewhere I couldn't place. The Blackbird never really belonged to us. She was something greater, something borrowed from a future we still don't understand. That last flight was just the end of our chapter, not hers. Because every now and then, late at night, when the sky is clear and quiet, I'll catch a flicker high above the horizon. A streak too fast, too high, too perfect to be anything ordinary. And I can't help but wonder if she ever really stopped flying. They said it was over. The flights, the missions, the secrets, locked away in vaults and storage rooms no one would ever enter again. But the truth is, you don't just shut down something like the Blackbird. You don't just close a door on a machine that could outrun the sun and skim the edge of space. You carry it with you, whether you want to or not. I learned that years after the last official flight, when the calls started coming in. Quiet calls. Always from people who had no reason to find me, but somehow did. A retired engineer from Palmdale. A former mission planner from Beale. Even a civilian air traffic controller who swore he tracked something impossible on his radar one night in '94, long after the State Route 71 had been grounded. They all wanted to talk. At first, I thought it was just nostalgia, men clinging to memories, needing to unburden themselves. But the more I listened, the more I realized these weren't just stories. They were warnings, confessions, fragments of something bigger that none of us had ever been allowed to piece together. One of the first calls came from Carter. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. His voice was rough, almost paranoid, like he'd been carrying a weight for too long. "You remember that last flight," he said. "How could I forget? There was more to it," he whispered. "Something we were never told. Something in the data we didn't see." He wouldn't say more on the phone, but a week later, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with coordinates and a date, July 1986. I recognized the location, an air corridor over the Atlantic we'd used during a high-speed run to Europe. There was no note, no explanation. Just the numbers, burned into my mind like an old scar. Not long after that, I met with one of the engineers. He was dying, lungs wrecked from years of working around exotic fuels and chemicals. He told me about anomalies in the telemetry, patterns in the data nobody could explain. Sometimes, the aircraft's sensors recorded altitude changes the pilots never experienced. Other times, fuel consumption didn't match flight profiles, as if, for brief moments, the jet had been somewhere else entirely. "It wasn't a malfunction," he said, coughing between words. "We built that bird too well. She didn't fail. She went beyond." The strangest story came from a radar operator stationed in Alaska. He was young back then, barely 20, watching Soviet airspace during the height of the Cold War. One night, his scope lit up with a return moving at impossible speeds, higher than anything manned aircraft should have been. He logged the event, but his report disappeared the next day. "They told me it was an error," he said, his hands shaking as he spoke. "But I know what I saw. And it wasn't a glitch. It was yours. It had to be." I've heard dozens of stories like that since. Pilots swearing they saw contrails high above them when nothing should have been there. Maintenance crews whispering about unexplained stress fractures in the airframes, like the jet had been somewhere physics didn't want it to be. Even a janitor at Palmdale who swore he walked past an empty hangar late one night, only to hear the faint hum of engines that shouldn't have been running. I used to dismiss it all. The human mind loves patterns, after all. It loves filling in gaps. But then there were the nights, long, quiet nights, when I'd catch myself staring at the sky, wondering if we'd touched something we were never meant to touch. The part that haunts me the most isn't the missions, or the secrets, or the classified reports that will never see the light of day. It's the way the Blackbird made you feel. Like you weren't just flying an aircraft, but borrowing a piece of something greater, something that didn't belong entirely to us. There's a stretch of desert outside Edwards Air Force Base where the runways have long since cracked and faded. I drove out there once, years after retirement, just to stand on the tarmac. The wind was sharp, the sun brutal. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I swore I could feel the rumble beneath my feet, the J-58S spinning up, the air alive with that familiar growl. People ask me if the Blackbird is really gone. I tell them what they want to hear, that she's a relic, a museum piece, a chapter closed. But sometimes, when I'm honest with myself, I know better. The sky keeps its secrets, and so does she. I think about those coordinates Carter sent me. I never went there. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find, or afraid of finding nothing at all. But sometimes, late at night, I plot them on a map, tracing the path of that old Atlantic corridor, and I wonder if there's still something out there, some echo of what we once were, still moving too fast, too high, for anyone to ever truly catch. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be told in full. Maybe they live in the silences, in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. All I can tell you is this: every time I hear the distant roar of a jet slicing across the sky, I look up. And for just a moment, I let myself believe that somewhere, somehow, the blackbird is still flying.